what I find ironic is that this is the same title that I have from 2 years ago, which I had no idea at the time when I made the title. So I guess I have something of what's called a one-trick pony going here. Okay. There's the title, so it may look familiar. And what I want to start off with is, what is multispectral? And it's more channels than RGB, and it's fewer channels than hyperspectral. So hyperspectral cameras are usually that the number of wavelengths, so you're capturing spectral information, the number of wavelengths is the number of sensors in one direction, basically. So you could have thousands of wavelengths as a hyperspectral camera, and that's going to give you an awful lot of information, versus 3, which is going to give you good color information, but nothing else. So if you're looking for more data to give you conservation information, RGB is insufficient. And so this was the system that I brought here 2 years ago. Okay. So the goal today is to try to evaluate different approaches to multispectral imaging systems, and that this is going to be a simulation, so it's all computational. Okay, so the first system is the CNAR CTM, which stands for color to match, which I remember going, you're calling it what? But I do remember CTM, so I guess it works. And I'm going to evaluate this 2 ways. First as an RGB camera, and second as a multispectral camera. And on the right here are the sensitivities, and you can see that you end up with a pair of blues that are different, 2 reds that are different, the greens are pretty much the same. So it's sort of a 5-channel camera. And you get this by having 2 filters that are slid in front. All of these camera systems will have their IR filter removed, as Keats talked about this morning. Okay, the second system is this Sony A7R3 multi-shot, which is what I'm going to be using in Friday's tutorial. So this is work that was just done in the last month or so. And in this case, I'm using 1 more filter. So I'm adding a 3rd filter to this, and we'll see why at some point. And again, you can see here that the main difference is I've now replaced one of those greens, which was fairly redundant, with a long wavelength. So I've extended the range of the sensor, which is going to improve my spectral estimation. Third system, this is what I described 2 years ago, is a panchromatic camera, or more commonly, we just call it a monochrome camera. So depending on who I'm talking to, I don't want to get beat up for that. And it's got 7 filters, and again, everything so far is a xenon strobe. And so these filters had been designed not just for spectral, but for spectral accuracy, color accuracy, and low image noise. And what that means is that you end up with your spectrum not uniformly sampled. So it's not the same thing as using interference filters. And this particular configuration, I want it to be able to do UV collection. So this wavelength is sort of at the beginning of the visible, and that this is my long wavelength to help me with my spectral accuracy. So when I do color, really I'm only using these 5 filters. So I've got 5 to then estimate 3. Okay, there's a light source company called LED Motive out of Barcelona, and they produce a light source that looks like this, that's LED individually controllable. And it's actually in the mail to me coming, so when I get home it'll probably be there. The thing that was very appealing to me is it's round. It's actually designed for to use in architectural lighting, which means I can hang a reflector on this, and now I have a conventional light source the way we're used to seeing in a photographic studio. So to me, that's very exciting. And this system can be used for any number of these LEDs combined. And in this case, I'm going to demonstrate 5 channels, 10 and 12. So these 2 on the end are a special order that they will provide, and that gives me, again, the short and the long wavelength estimation. So this little movement here actually adds a fair amount in terms of spectral performance. Okay, so let's look at targets. So because I want to relate to everybody, I'm using our friend, the color checker SG, to build my profile. So this is what's being used to build the profile for color stuff. And then as far as evaluating color, this is the next generation target that's made by Avian Rochester, and it's independent data, right? It's not the same samples used to build the profile, important. And then for my spectral piece, I'm using this artist paint target, which is made using artist paint, so it includes cobalt blue and ultramarine and some of the colors that are difficult to reproduce, as well as it's got L-star 50 for Scott. Okay. Well, I asked him, what do you think? He goes, I need L-star 50. Okay. The other target is a spectral image, and this is called the RIT Metacow, which stands for Metameric Cow. So in the early 2000s, I think this came out in 2004, apparently the wireframe that was easily available to all these guys was either a sphere or a cow. And so, Metasphere, Metacow, obviously sexier. And wow, you're pretty good. This is good. I guess all that coffee and candy did the job. Okay. So what this target is each half of the cow has a different spectral properties. Okay? So if I had a camera system that's perfect, it'll measure both of these as identical. So that's the way the eye would see this under daylight illumination. Okay. But if I change the lighting, in this case incandescent, notice that the cows mismatch, and in some cases rather badly. So one of the things to think about is that spectral imaging, or the multispectral imaging, would be able to do this or this, right? If you've got an RGB image, you can't do this. You need a spectral image to do this, okay? So it's just something to think about, and while we're going through this talk, I was trying to think about a specific word. Right, we're a whole room of photographers. Many of us have an awful lot of influence, and we represent leverage for the camera community to start to develop products that have more spectral opportunities. Okay, so I'm going to simulate camera system. So here I am doing my work here. And the thing that's just so much fun is because I can simulate all these camera signals for all of those samples, and it only takes 1 line of code. So, for a programmer, it's like, well, of course. But again, for all the rest of you, it's just nice to see why you might want to do simulation, right? It'd be a lot of photography. Eventually, I will do the real imaging. Okay, so in our research flow, we have 2 different workflows. One's color processing, the other is spectral processing. So this is kind of the usual stuff: image registration, flat fielding, moving the thing from the analog world to the digital world, linear raw signals. I then input to do my floating point calculations. I have the magic color transform, which converts these some number of signals to XYZ. Then there's another transformation to get RGB, and we encode in either something called ETRGB or ProPhoto RGB. And then when I'm done here, I have my image, and it's got its profile attached. And the calibration target is the color checker, SG. The spectral processing is in fact simpler. All this stuff's the same. I now have a spectral transform, which can then be used to give me reflectances. And in this case now, I can use this spectral data either directly to do some conservation science, and in the future, we'll be able to encode this thing in ICC MAX, which is a new ICC protocol for spectral data. Okay, so in conservation, so we have a software here. As I move this mouse around, I get a curve shape. Okay, so does anybody want to tell me what pigment that is? I guess no. So it's cobalt blue, right? I'm trying to, give Carl a, step up, And that's kind of important if I'm a conservator and I want to make sure I use cobalt blue for the retouch, right? So here I am creating data for conservation. That's part of my normal workflow. Okay, the other thing that we can do is color reconstructions. So I thought in honor of being in Amsterdam, I would show Van Gogh, if I did that correct. I think only the Americans are laughing. So anyway, with this sort of spectral data, I can simulate a lake pigment that he used that had faded, right? And so here we could see the difference, how the painting might have looked and how the painting looks today. So you need spectral data to do that. Okay, so let's look at results. And when you talk about color accuracy, you talk about what's the average delta E. So that's like the magic. Once you say delta E, you are a color scientist. So that's all it takes. It's very simple. I'm way overeducated. Okay. And what's a delta E? It's just a distance in 3 space, right? I take my tape measure between me and any of you, and that distance is a delta E. Just a distance metric. And the goal here, if I'm looking at the histogram of all of these samples, notice that I'm in the bin between 0 and 0.5 delta E, right? That would be pretty cool to have that level of accuracy. So that's what we're looking for. Okay, here it is all on one graph. Sorry about that. The thing that you want to look at really is we're looking at how these shapes change. So here is the RGB cameras, right? Their average here is less than 1, right? So they're good color cameras, but you have outliers. As you add more filters, notice that the outliers are going away. That's the big thing of multispectral. It's not the average delta E, it's the bad colors. Those get acceptable. Now, as we move to more channels, you can see that this was a system from 2 years ago, right? You can see that that histogram is a lot in the first bin. I can now use that lead motive light and take 5 images, and you can see on paper my average is 0.2. And as I go to these 10 or 12 channels, my average now is 0.1, right? Everything is in that bin. So on paper, this LED approach can be fantastic if your materials are not fluorescent. Okay. Here's another way of the color accuracy using our Medi-Cal friend. The goal is to have both sides match. Okay, here's the CNR as an RGB camera, right? If I go and buy one, this is its performance. And metameric pairs are very, very sensitive to differences between our human visual system and the camera as an observer. And you can see that there's some bad color matches. Now, here is the CNR CTM system. Notice the improvement in the color match. It's not perfect, but it's quite improved. This was why this system was developed using 2 filters to get better color accuracy. Here's the 7-filter system from 2 years ago. It's okay, but it was designed to do more things. Here's the Sony as an RGB camera. I was pretty impressed by this. So Sony, although its differences are very slight between the Sony and a DALSA chip, the difference in performance is quite large. If I now use these 3 filters, you can see that the color match is pretty much right there. So we can get very high color accuracy. 5-channel, 10, 12, all those are pretty much right there. So you can see that as you add channels, you're improving color accuracy. Okay, another way we can look at this, so I'm trying to go between images and graphs so you stay interested. This is what's called, the black line is called a color matching function. This represents the, I'll say sensitivity in quotations. It represents how the average observer sees color in a standardized way. And so you want your camera to match those shapes. So that's the goal here, match the shapes. There's a metric called mu factor, and I'm not going to explain it, and if you know it, you already know it. And the goal is to get that mu factor as close to 1 as possible. 1, good, okay. And usually in the kind of imaging world we're in, you want the number to be above 0.9. Okay. So if you look at these different camera systems, so here is the Sony, or the CNR and the Sony. If you look at the bottom, you can see that the fits are really bad, right? There's a lot of wiggling going on. That's why you don't get the high color accuracy. Notice that as you start the CTM system, which was designed for that particular CCD DALSA chip, notice that I'm getting pretty good fits. Here's the Sony, not so good. Notice that as we start adding filters, particularly when we get to the LED systems, that the fits are all really close. So the ability to have multiple channels is improving my color accuracy potential. Okay. Let's look at spectral accuracy. So again, a big part of this is to have data that can be used by conservators or for high quality multi-ink printing or for better documentation, right? There's a lot of things that going beyond 3 gives you. And so here I'm looking at spectral error. So I'm looking at the difference between my camera estimate and my measurement on my I1. And we're doing that for this target. So the goal here is to have everything right around 0. I'm not going to show RGB because they're not designed to do spectral. So, on the left you can see, if I had, my laser has died, of course, right? We talked about this during the break. That's, deep conversations. If you look on the left here, so this is sort of the system from 4 years ago. Notice that there's a lot of error at long wavelengths. Because we're looking at the spread of the data. And now, as the Finger Lake system, you can see that part of that 7 channels was to bring that error down. Here's the Sony with 3 filters. Performance is pretty close to the 7 filter. So you can see that adding that 3rd filter sort of transforms the error that's shown in the CNR to what's shown in the Sony. And obviously you could add a 3rd filter to the CNR, or you could do this with any camera once you remove its IR cut filter. Here's the 10 channel on the left, and you can see that in the middle, the errors are really small, right? And then they kind of blow up at the 2 ends. By adding those 2 extra LEDs, this error is really, this is really small. And so, to me, This is equivalent to a hyperspectral camera, except this could be a hyperspectral camera that's not at 6 megapixels or 3 megapixels, but at 150 megapixels. That's a big deal. Okay. So in conclusion, the thing that's kind of exciting to me is that as cameras continue to evolve, we're getting better and better performance, right? So we saw that comparing the Sony with the DALSA chip. And who knows what's going to be in the future with Nikon and Canon. If you want high color accuracy, not just on average, but all the way through, you need to go beyond RGB. And this is where we leverage the industry to give us more. Because where you tend to be doing your color correction, right, is the one bad color that I've got to now spend an hour on to get it right. Okay. RGB and 3 filters, less than $5,000. So the camera, and it's multi-shot, right? No, no spatial interpolation. Oh, demosaicing, sorry, lost the word. Right, you don't have to do that. And so to replace the IR filter, to buy the color filters, to get a good lens is less than $5,000, right? That's pretty amazing for a 44 megapixel multi-shot that's giving you this kind of accuracy. Having a monochrome camera and one of these programmable LEDs is going to give you performance equal to a hyperspectral camera. That could be an amazing opportunity for conservation science. And then we can also combine the LED lights to 5. So I can make a 5-channel camera and nail color differences. Okay, so future activities, I got to test this light when it comes in, right? This is all on paper. My particular camera is a 50 megapixel Kodak sensor. And then in the future, this is, right, here's my leverage, right? I'm talking to some company out there that I know has a little setup here, right? Is to get, basically to be able to try out one of these phase 1, 150 megapixel panchromatic with this kind of LED stuff, and either have a apochromatic lens that's fantastical or some sort of focus stacking that works well. And finally, I've been getting 16 years of continuous funding from the Mellon Foundation to be doing the things that I've been talking about here for these 3 conferences. That funding is ending May 30th, and I just want to give a shout out to thank the Mellon Foundation for all of that support, which has been significant. And that's it. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Roy. Carl, you have been introduced a bit by Roy, so I invite you.
That's the wrong show. That's our workshop.
There you are. Good afternoon. It's pretty late in the afternoon, and this is a boring topic I'm presenting today. It's color management. Oh, shit. Nobody wants color management. You only go into color management if your pain level is high enough with color. The topic is cobalt blue. Does it look right? Does it? Which one? Actually, this one looks right. This is the original, courtesy of Roy. The artist is here. Thank you. No, but Roy brought it with him. Okay, so we actually don't know which one looks right unless we do have the original here and some other factors. What's involved in the process of digitization in general or in cultural heritage? It's the illuminant that allows us to take a picture at all, no light, no picture, no color. It's, of course, the pigments or dyes in the object that we want to capture, the spectral reflectance of that. It's the scanner or camera and the lens, as Roy pointed out. Then we can destroy a lot of color if we choose the wrong ICC profile that we convert color into, regardless if we come from multispectral or RGB data. What's the first device that we see color after digitization? It's the monitor. And the monitor needs to be calibrated, so the instrument is also a factor in this process. And it is the human observer with its spectral sensitivity. Finally, the viewing light that we view the original under. So let's have a look at the light. There are different methods of qualifying light, quality control, be it a flash or a continuous light or LED light. There has been a method of judging light for many years. I don't know how many, Roy, do you? CRI, it's pretty old measure for light. 70s, yeah. And actually it's outdated. It uses 8 plus 7 colors, 8 for the standard CRI, color rendering index, and 7 more for the extended color rendering index. But there is a new method, TM30-15, that uses 99 different spectra to judge the quality of color. And they also invented 2 new factors that allow to judge color of the light, the quality of the light. And that's the fidelity index, which is similar to the color rendering index. And important, the gamut index. Some lights tend to expand the gamut compared to a, let's say, D50 light. And this is as bad as reducing the gamut. So some colors look oversaturated and others not saturated enough. So let's get to the title of this talk, Cobalt Blue. Why did I choose Cobalt Blue as a sample for this talk? It's one of the most notorious pigments in artwork reproduction. And the spectrum shows why that is. It's jagged in the blue part of the remission of light that you shine onto this pigment. And it has a steep rise of the spectrum at the long end of the visible spectrum, way into the visible spectrum. So this makes it sensitive to metameric failure, be it different viewing lights, different observers, or different camera sensors. This is the spectrum of ultramarine blue, which is pretty well behaved, as you can see. It's a smooth curve, and the rise at the end of the spectrum, at the long end, the red end of the spectrum, starts very late, where we do not perceive color a lot. So this is not as sensitive to metameric failure. So this picture is made of cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, and there are some other colors in there. I can't pronounce this one. And it often is abbreviated as phthalo, without the cyanine. Perol red, Hansa yellow, white of course, and that's it. So cobalt blue is not unique in this picture. It's a very old pigment, and it is in many pieces of art that we know. So it's pretty common. And so is the problem we have with reproducing these pieces of art. Next portion that we want to cover here, camera. It requires profiling, as Roy pointed out already. We have different types of profiles. We have an ICC workflow for TIFF JPEG images. We have a DCP or a RAW workflow with digital camera profiles. These are fundamentally different, and you have to look at your workflow, what is required there. A lot of cameras or imaging products, software, come with canned profiles. With a canned profile, which is an average profile, you get average results. So camera profiling is essential. I've seen lenses that differ in their spectral transmission a lot. So you don't only have to profile a camera with a lens, but the same camera with any lens that you use for reproduction. And camera targets. We saw the color checker SG, but one target doesn't fit all. You really need to have a target like the artist paint target that includes the pigments that you want to reproduce. So cobalt blue is the example here. And now comes the prophecy part of this talk. ICC Max, Roy already mentioned that, will help to solve a lot of today's problems. And it's not only a means of handling spectral data. ICC Max is the next step up from ICC, and it's backwards compatible. You can do everything with ICC Max that you can do with ICC version 4 today, and much, much more. So how do we solve this problem with a trichromatic device, today's RGB camera? Targets made to measure would help. And thanks to a company in Germany that makes pigments, and Kai Mewes, where is he? Kai? there. Who did most of the work here. We have a library of some 1,000 pigments. We have the spectral data, and we have photos of these pigments. This will allow us, and I didn't find the time so far to do the work, but again, the prophecy part here. This will allow us to make conservation targets. Scott, thanks for this name for the targets. For different periods in time, for different periods of art, and that will allow to capture these different works of art with a trichromatic camera better than with a standard target. Next part, the working space that we use to convert data into. We should keep our raw or DNG data for reference and for the future, because as technology evolves, we will definitely will have better methods of converting raw into three-color RGB or other formats. So the working space should be as large as necessary, and Adobe RGB, which is commonly used, is definitely not big enough. What you see here is some colors or all the colors that are in this image, and some of them are outside the Adobe RGB color space, as you can see here. If we convert to Adobe RGB, that's what you get. Colors get clipped at the edge of the Adobe RGB color space, and they are lost forever. So what you need is a color space that's large enough. That could be Melissa. Anybody who knows Melissa color space or profile? Most probably not. That's one of the most hidden secrets of Adobe. They use Melissa color space in Lightroom as their working space internally. It's got the same shape and size as ProPhoto and the same as ProStar, which just has a different tonal response curve gradation inside. So here you see that this covers all the colors of this image and most probably all the colors of any other image that you may want to reproduce. What you need there is definitely 16 bits per channel image, because the color space is too big. For an 8-bit image, you will get artifacts and banding and stuff like that. So the monitor needs calibration, and we should calibrate the monitor to the viewing conditions so that you don't have simultaneous contrast between your viewing light and your monitor. What we cannot change in a monitor is the spectral characteristics, the spectral emission of the monitor. It's defined by the backlight and the LCD elements. So metamerism involved here. We also need to profile a monitor so that our workflow knows what the monitor looks like. The gamut is limited, so you can see that here. There are colors outside our monitor space. What you see is what you get, partially, but not completely. So in your work, you should use a gamut warning, the purple color here, so that you know which colors cannot be reproduced on your monitor, and you don't start to fiddle around with these colors because you think they are wrong. No, they are not wrong. They are just not visible on your monitor. The hardest part, the human observer. There are standards, and Roy showed them. Standard observer, 10 degrees, 2 degrees, whatever, defined in 1931. Computing power was not quite at a state as your watch or your at that time, so there definitely were errors. These models have been improved over time, but the human observer is not a standard observer, even not the improved version of 1964. FOGRA, the German Institute for the Graphic Arts industry, did a study on observer metamerism. They tested 79 observers. They had 5 color samples, metameric color samples. And in order to get the results halfway right, they repeated these tests with each of the observers 3 times. This is the spread of these colors of these observers in the 5 color samples. The mean inter-observer delta E was 1.3. So the 3 samples were pretty close per observer. But the maximum to average, the extreme observer compared to the average, which is the red cross here in our, no, sorry, yeah, the red one, was delta E15, which is quite a lot. If you reproduce something, measure, and you find a delta E of 15, you throw it in the bin because it's useless. But that's the difference between the worst observer and the average. That means that the 2 opposite observers, the 2 worst observers, are up to delta E 30. So that's quite a lot. I must concede that they used very a hard test. Metameric LEDs were used to do this test, so in real life it's a bit smaller, but not so much. Yep. Stop now or in 1 minute. So we did the test, or these are the curves for these observers. And this is the simulated result between 2 of these observers. And you can see that The standard observer is pretty close to this one. We can show that outside in standard light. And the two observers are pretty far off. Conclusion, we need an adjustable light that allows us to adjust our perception to that of our reference, so that we see the same thing on the monitor and with the original. And that can be done with multispectral lighting that you can tune to your personal perception of color. Thank you, and yeah.
So to end today, I want to invite Scott. We will conclude this session with a panel discussion with several other color specialists in the audience, but first Scott will have a go.
Hello. Thanks, Cecile. Thanks, everyone at the Rijksmuseum for hosting a growing conference. I had a little experience during one of the coffee breaks. Someone talked about outsourcing something, 3D scanning or something like that, and I had a flashback that before Cecile was here, the museum worked with, when I was consulting, they were being approached by an external scan vendor that said we could digitize the whole museum. You really shouldn't go and keep this photo studio going in this direction. And that was the pitch they were getting. And I just wanted to say, I realized that if the museum went in that direction, when was that, 2004, 2005, it could be that we would all not be here sharing this. We may not have moved standards forward back then, because all the work to revise this studio is what really has led to a global discussion. So I'm not down on outsourcing, but I'm big on insourcing, and I'm big on information sharing. So what I'd like to talk about, and it'll lead to the panel discussion, is sort of a little look back. And you know, the panel is comprised of people who were there at the time when these discussions were happening. Starting with Roy's benchmark study in 2005. Cecile and Barbara from the Met were very supportive of doing an international print test. That's where we met Carl, who was nice enough to characterize the press to see if calibrated pictures worked without intervention. Those discussions around that time, the Metamorphose and FADGI initiatives were happening, and they were happening in an uncoordinated, disjointed way, both aiming at the same end, but almost zero communication in the beginning. Then the second RIT study with Franziska Frey and Susan Farnand was where we introduced some of those early standard objective captures into the formal studies, and the results were great. But it took till 2017 to codify and bring together these different standards. In fact, on the last slide you saw, this was a big moment where we invited the FADGI and Metamorphose people. We did a workshop live on stage at an IS&T conference to force the issue of cooperating. But it took that long. So the crux of my discussion, and I'm so happy Cecile invited me to speak today and do this panel, is we're facing a lot of new technology, spectral imaging, new ICC Max, this and that. We need to accelerate this process of getting our act together because we can't afford to make missteps with the technology. So now let's just take a breather and look at some images. I'll keep my mouth shut. I shortened this. I wish I didn't have to shorten it, because to me, this is what all this is about. There's our collection. I think this represents the high end of museum imaging. Does anything stand out as strange or different? Okay. That's great, because most of these are from our great photographers at the Met, the true advanced imagers in our department, because they see and render texture and form better than we can do with all the high technology right now. We're working towards other methods in advanced imaging. But these seven images or so were shot by a fellow in northern Iraq out of less than $10,000 backpack kit that we provided to people in Iraq and Syria, along with training. And Heyman wasn't a photographer. I think he was a back-end computer guy. He really wasn't a photographer at all. And through training with a photographer and technical standards, we were able to accomplish some great things. This is the photographer right here. But one day, we were working with them still, and we had we've been emailing to look at work that they're using for a publication, and I could literally throw them into the Met's daily meeting. And I said, you know what? I want to share this, because 2 years ago, we talked about this project. And to me, it represents everything we're doing, everyone, not just the Met, in uplifting this worldwide. So to me, the ISO standard is really saying, in our hands, whatever type of imaging we're doing, we can choose to load our cameras with one standard roll of film, wherever we are, whatever language we speak. And what the problem before was that we had Metamorphose and Fadji speaking different languages to get to the same end. But it took that long to get to the point where we can agree. And you'll notice, here's the current state right now, as of even right now. Sorry for the blurry photo. But typically for a Metamorphose workflow, you would have your UTT chart to check all the resolution elements, and then you would use a color chart like an SG or others to calibrate your system and validate the color performance. I really shouldn't put an X through the dice target over there, because I'd call it a work in progress, because the dice target actually does not satisfy all of the ISO requirements. So the Library of Congress has really worked to revise their targets. And what's interesting is there's a new target. Don Williams will be talking about that in Lisbon. And it's very interesting because they're taking all of the elements of the UTT plus in a Munsell patch version, the ability to calibrate and validate your workflow on one chart. So what we've accomplished is now the Metamorphose and Fadji both aim to ISO language, but you could still use this as well as any other in-house tolerances or spectral imaging. We're talking about the same delta E's and all that. So these are the things that come in the package when you do your technical camera validation, and I don't want to waste time on the details. So what does that get us? It gets us the master images for the artwork reproduction and growing in an area of conservation documentation, which in that space, in the Met, for example, we're rolling out the ISO throughout the museum. So the Canons on the copy stands with Lightroom, we bring to the ISO spec, whether it's any brand of camera, we could bring them together. And then for the new thing that we're seeing is using these validated images as the source of the photogrammetry. It really helps with reflective objects. It helps accurately render, of course, for computational imaging, and as the basis of the visible part of this spectral imaging that people are doing. There's one other image that I'll point out. And that's not an image at all. It's actually a RTX scan rendered with a paint texture. And this is a big thing we're working on at the Met, is I'm really not happy with the quality. We know what quality is, and sometimes with 3D and new technology, it's like we accept this when we should be aiming here. Because I don't see the point in sending that out to the public if it's not a complete representation. And that's a big challenge, but that's where we should end up. Here's some renders, and most of these are renders from laser scans, just the form rendered in a photographic way. Very simple. I wouldn't say simple. Would you guys say simple? Not simple yet, but necessary, because we could just show you the laser scan data that we've seen many of during this conference, but you know what? People really react when it has a real weight and shadow to it. I cut out some slides because I thought we would go right into the panel discussion. I think we are pretty familiar with a lot of the details, with Roy and Carl covering so much. I think if you're all right, maybe we'll just bring some people out and have a chat. What? Oh, yeah. So Roy, Carl, is Hans here? Keats Webb and Paul Messier. I think that's our group. Yes, I'm sorry. Hopefully we don't run out of seats, Rob. I guess I messed up with the seating, but that's okay. So, before everyone is introduced, I think, Paul, maybe introduce yourself and Hans and Carl, just because, and Hans, because we didn't really see you talk today, so just a quick.
Test. Oh, good. So I'm Paul Messier. I'm a photograph conservator. I head up a research lab at Yale University and was in private practice for a number of years doing photograph conservation. And I'm on the program talking about UV-Vis documentation tomorrow morning.
Okay. And Hans, just for the people who don't know you, I think most
Hello,
people know
everybody.
you.
My name is Hans van Doornmolen. I'm the author of the Metamorphose Preservation Imaging Guidelines. Hello.
Well, again, in my talk, actually everyone here has been involved peripherally in everything I showed on screen. But Paul and Keats represent something interesting to me, and I'm glad you were able to come. And that is, where do we go from here? We've heard a lot of these topics about the spectral imaging and all this futuristic stuff. I wonder, looking back at where we were 14 years ago, how can we improve the process? How can we get the standards moving faster? And I think that's involving these discussions. So, Roy, maybe do you have any thoughts on what you see from your vantage point with all the, like the spectral lighting and all that?
I already gave my thoughts.
Yeah. Well, you saw that it's tight, but from a standards perspective, so how do we get moving in a way that's opened?
I mean, when I've looked at the ISO standard, it seems like it's gone not far enough to me. So I see that as a big step forward, but still a work in progress. And I think that the people who are involved in standards need to, spend a little bit more time, and maybe people who are chairs need to beat on their members more.
To tighten it up.
The time scale really needs to shrink.
Yeah, and to that, what he's referring to is the ISO, I think, for average delta E's is acceptable in a high end, something like that.
Well, and it's still delta E C lab, right?
Yeah, and so, now when you look at the precision raising, we have to look at that. What we do is in-house, we run it tighter, but it'd be nice if everything moves forward. And Paul, you know, we've encountered working with each other on peripherally through the UV Innovations targets. And that's an area that strikes me as similar to where we were a while back with what we're aiming at and how do we open that discussion, which is happening now. But in a way, I'm looking at how we can accelerate it as an ISO effort is going on to gather the right information from Roy and everyone here.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the goal in principle, of course. I think implementation is going to be difficult when you start pushing into really rapidly moving spaces like, you know, multimodal, multispectral, hyperspectral. I mean, these are areas that are developing so fast. I think it might be really challenging for the standards-making community, the end users who want to achieve some sort of interoperability in their practice, to keep up. I think that's going to be true maybe for a little while.
Yeah.
I'm not saying these are not worthwhile efforts, and we should understand what the variables are, for sure, and be cognizant of all of these, these different moving parts. But I'm not sure. I don't know if because the work that I've done with UV-Vis fluorescence has really taught me, I think, a lot, and almost sort of chastened me a little bit in terms of kind of getting out ahead of kind of where the technology are, where the users are.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I mean, I think that's good feedback. I'm feeling like running through the line, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Is that okay? So, Keats, I know we spoke briefly about the adoption topics of these standards and as they've emerged, and from a conservation perspective.
I'd like to go back to my presentation this morning about those three areas of museum imaging, so the collections, photography, conservation documentation, and scientific imaging. And so we see kind of best practices and standards in different ways in those different areas. So I see that FADGI, Metamorphose, and then the new ISO standards are more collections photography. And at least in the US, I don't see that being as widely used within conservation documentation. There may be a gap in terms of the accessibility of that in terms of resources and how to implement it into the conservation documentation that's going on. So whether that's getting tied in with AIC, their Guide to Digital Documentation and Conservation Photography, or Digital Photography and Conservation Documentation, one of those.
I did that project a long time ago. I don't remember either. Yeah.
And then also the scientific imaging, which is going directly to some of the ISO standards that are not that are embedded within FADGI or within the cultural heritage ISO standard. So looking at those and figuring out how those kind of come together. I know that a few years ago we had a conversation about ISO standards, and I found that it was challenging to access those, both in terms of you have to pay for them, and so some institutions, they're not expensive necessarily, but to purchase them through an institution can be difficult. And then it's not something that you pick up and read once and then you're ready to go. So there is that consideration, but I think it is really important to have those in the community as a foundation that we can all come back to, and at least a starting point to be working from.
That's great. I think your slide of the areas coming together was spot on. I mean, we feel that, we see that science, collection imaging, it's all merging together because we're all in the same boat when we have a camera in our hand. We're really imaging that same artwork in different departments in the museum, different museums, so it makes sense to bring that together. I think the international standards are the way to get there, but it is a difficult process, definitely. It's actually a terrible process. It takes way too long. So from a science perspective, what are your thoughts? Like when you get a conservator saying, I found something with my RGB camera, and then they kick it off to you to investigate, and you're like, well, that's not really what's happening. Do you run into these mismatches, or could it be better dialogues?
Well, I guess I would echo the same concerns that Keats expressed about accessibility, in the sense that, yeah, I teach some color science at the university, and I understand how all this stuff works. But in the end, for the day-to-day photography that's not done by a photographer who's trained in all of these standards and how to apply them and the right way to do color management, the whole workflow. We still have to support, for example, conservators who are using a microscope.
Yeah, well, and we
the
talked
color
about that.
management on a microscope is a thing where you can't photograph 140 patches of the color card every time you take. And so we have to have a color profile, and we just have to have a drag and drop tool where people take their microscope images and put it onto the tool and just hope for the best. So the various problems that exist, in my view, is the huge gap between the people who are really at the leading edge of knowledge of what's the state of the art and the average person who just has to use this in the museum when they're not a photographer. So yeah, we see a lot of issues with this doesn't look like that. I took a photo of this last week and it looks different now. Why is that? Well, you know, that's like
They know the problem, but solving it can be difficult.
I mean, the fact, I mean, on our microscope, for example, our color is, the light is changing color over time with a curve that we don't know.
Right.
So
So we could apply this process to fix it, but it's very awkward and time-consuming, bottom line.
Yeah, so I don't know what the solution is, but at some level it seems that there could be some kind of a light, extra light thing that doesn't require a whole lot of expertise, but that still brings some of the benefits of color science and the latest advances to those people who really don't know the first thing about color science. What are tristimulus values, for example?
Right. Well, I guess Roy mentioned earlier the idea of kicking it to the manufacturers. I've mentioned that in the past. We've had some successes. We have some camera systems with built-in profiling. We have none that do built-in ISO validation. But ISO, this has only been out 2 years. Maybe it's time to say when we buy equipment, we want ISO validation and calibration in the system or available as an add-on, because that's how you lower the bar of training and accessibility, like the Zeiss microscope discussion. We're all big customers as a group. But maybe Carl, I'll get your thoughts, and Hans, because you've been out in the field doing it. But what are your thoughts from ICC? Carl's on ICC panel, I'm not. So what goes on there? What do they talk about? What's the future looking like?
The future definitely is ICC Max. It's a work of Max Derhak. It's his doctorate thesis, and he did a great job in defining a new method of handling color, being as well compatible, backwards compatible to the standard ICC of today, and also into the future, into the foreseeable future. It handles spectral data. You can use spectra as a profile connection space, which is wow. There are the first products out in the market that use ICC Max as an engine to a certain extent, not completely, and that will take another couple of years before anything is out there that's usable. But if you look at ICC, it's been 25 years now. You know that?
Yeah. Okay.
So it'll take another 10 years before ICC Max is fully established in the market.
Oh, well. To the next generation, Hans, what are your thoughts? You've been in the field, you know, to speak to what Keats brought up about accessibility and just...
Yeah, it's about knowledge, I think. People have to understand what they are doing and why. And the why part is very important. Why go for correct exposure, correct gain modulation, stuff like that. And this is very important, the understanding part. And also the adoption of the industry is very important. So, but I see a growing adoption by the industry, and also, look here, how many people are here, you know?
Yeah, I noticed
so
that.
There is a growing interest in the standards and the technical area. So this is good.
My presentation was today trying to look back and say, it's all possible. We've done it. We're there. we have this, but where we go from here is interesting. Does anyone have any questions or ideas about how we can accelerate the process or leverage the energy in this room to move this a little further and faster? And that could be any number of things. Any ideas? Yes?
Well, I don't know if people can hear me. Scott, this is great, and it's great to have this panel of people here. In our work with standards and knowledge management and standards like the CDOC CRM, which has now been adopted by ICOM and the International Federation of Library Associations, it became clear to us that we needed to put the implementation of this standard under the hood of the car in software such that people could just go do their jobs and have as much of this kind of management done for them without requiring a knowledge of doing it themselves. In terms of spreading the knowledge of best practices, I think it's critical that all of the people who are doing this kind of imaging, particularly cultural heritage documentation, have a way of showing what they did, what practices they used, and display it in a way that someone can find it easily and check their work. Because if you don't have a record of what was done on how an image was created, how do you know the quality of that image, whether you say you're following standards or not?
It's the validation part, like the microscope. Checking your microscope before you do a before and after study. Yeah.
But also if you have really transparent knowledge and information that goes with these images, somebody can look at what you did at the Met, right, which is probably likely correct, and try to follow the process that was there. So anyway, that was my suggestion.
Any other thoughts? Or questions while we're here? Yes.
Maybe we should have a prize, whoever comes up with the best idea.
Maybe we're already doing the right things on the sidebar conversations at this conference. Yes, Barbara Boss.
I would just add that increasingly we recognize the importance of getting the highest levels of the administration of our museum involved in the knowledge base and adoption of standards. Someone had mentioned the grassroots movement coming up, but we also recognize how important it is to support our work from the top down. And that means that the administration has to engage in the learning process that Hans is referring to. So for instance, the monitor that we calibrate in the studio, and the cameras we calibrate and everything that we profile, when we get that correct, and a curator in another department, who the systems department has not supported for the last 5 years or 7 years in terms of their computer equipment, when they open our image on their machine and they're seeing something different from us, institutionally, that's wrong. So I think that in addition to the manufacturers, many of whom sit on the standards committees, so pushing there is critical, but also just pushing that message out and up in the institutions that we work in. So every museum director should have a calibrated monitor. And every museum director should talk to their peers and say, what are you doing in imaging? And I think that that's something that just has to happen for the future for all of this to eventually come together.
I agree.
Just to add to a comment that was made earlier about your suggestion that we keep raw files around. in the Rijksmuseum, I'm a huge proponent of an idea that I call pixel provenance, which is to say that when we take huge numbers of photos at very high resolution, we do color management, we do keystone correction, rotation, translation, stitching across multiple wavelengths, run it through another mill to put it online, and so on. What I want to be able to do is to put my finger on every pixel in the image and tell you exactly how the data got there, all the way back to the raw file, so that in the future, when any of these steps gets better, or I figure out that I did something wrong, I can go back. It's sort of the responsible thing to do from a conservation standpoint. If we're doing something wrong with the color management and we take thousands of photos and later realize that we threw away the raw files because we were out of space, I will be really sad.
I think I have an alternate view of that, because I don't think a raw file means anything, right? It has no meaning until it's calibrated. And so one of the things that when I see people talking about sort of how do I archive my collection, I understand the idea of keeping the raw data, but I don't think a raw file is a master image.
Oh, no.
So,
but there are times when, for example, we have realized that the color card that we built by having the camera far away from the painting, that the color profile we built from that photograph is inferior relative to a color profile that we get if we take a tile of the color card. And so then, knowing that, oh yeah, we can do a better job, I can go back, reproduce the standards, because we also try to be reproducible in the way we set up the camera and the lights that we use and so on, and make a comparison and see if we can do a better job. It's not a silver bullet, but
well, and I think what you said is we should have sat next to each other. I think what you said that's a really key point is that the image has calibration information in it, right? So you have your different color charts or whatever you need that helps define what these pixels mean. And I think that's a key component. If I just have a DNG with nothing else, I have nothing. So I think your point's good.
I have the mic, yeah. I'm sorry. Just a sidebar comment, because I cut slides out because I just wanted to kick it in to have this discussion, but in ISO, there's been a long-standing discussion about DNG, and actually of all companies, it's interesting that Apple is the one who kicked it over again to get them talking about DNG. Unfortunately, there's some other file formats coming. But I worry about like Roy's ETRGB not being supported and things like that. But one simple thing that's being talked about is a scene referred mode on a camera, which would kick you to be like essentially pretty much passing the current ISO stuff out of the box, just going to SR mode, scene referred mode on any camera, and your readouts would match your raw processor. Because right now, just exposing is not well defined. So what's being talked about are the things in there that define what scene referred is in the raw. And that would probably kick it forward a lot. But the manufacturers are dragging their feet because that would make all the cameras match technically out of the box in scene referred mode. So there's this push and pull of limiting innovation, but actually it holds us back. But that's something we're hoping to make progress on.
And I also mean things like in the Hasselblad focus application, when you turn on vignetting or you turn on lens correction, it's a black box. What is it doing?
Yeah, and there's a lot of black box. But I think there's some certain user rights. Color and tone, I think, should be that foundation part that should be more universal. Some of these extra features, like if you look at 3D, you can have a lot of proprietary stuff, but you can get your STL. But there needs to be some meat on the bone for us, and that's maybe what we can arrive at. What are the most mission-critical aspects of an image for reversibility that at least you can get back to there? I don't know. But maybe we should talk more as these things evolve. Yes?
Yeah, I might be changing the conversation slightly because my comment is actually related to the previous comment made in the audience about giving a director a color-calibrated monitor. I was thinking we should do more about educating the non-imaging audience about what we do and why it is important. Not just, you know, people from curatorial or within heritage, but also just the general public. Because quite often when I show them, you know, they show me an image on their iPhone 6 and they're like, isn't that brilliant?
Yeah.
Why are you buying this Hasselblad? Why not my iPhone 6? So there is, and you know, if that's the discussion we're having, to then come to them and be like, oh, you need to invest in this because of delta E and fudgy and all the rest of it, or the ISO standard, that learning curve is so massive that I think we need to do more about educating non-imaging heritage professionals of what we do, why it matters, why they should invest in us, and therefore, usually with investment comes faster progress.
Mm-hmm. And actually, you know, Roy just showed some extremely high-end examples on a $5,000 camera. On my slides, I showed the fellow in Iraq who's using a Fuji X-T1, and they're blending in with the Hasselblad. That's actually working the way it should. But what level of camera we choose should not be based on marketing, but technical performance. In fact, an iPhone could work and meet ISO as well. So to me, that's how big museums and small museums can share, is with the standards. And everyone will sell more cameras if we got on this page. Yes?
Scott, one thing we had talked about with DNG, if we could get them to encode, if not a secondary image of the target that we've taken under those scenes, if they could at least get the numerical reference and red values into it. Because one problem is everybody, like we kind of has been implied, everybody says, oh, save your raws, save your raws, save your raws. And you, okay, but okay, what light was that shot under? Do you have a target under with the,
what version of Lightroom?
That goes out the window. Yeah. So that's one. My other point, just kind of more broadly, is the 80-20 rule. And I don't think it's even 80-20 in that we spend 80% of our time doing 20% of our work. I think it's even worse than that, that we've created standards, like we can metamorphosa, we can Faggy 4-star the heck out of a letter from the director or something. We can nail that in every spec. And in everybody's collection, everybody's archives, there are thousands and thousands of that. But it's when, you know, there are far fewer guitars in the Met's collection than there are works on paper. And those things are much more challenging and much more, we can try and define the standards, but we bend and we flex the rules a lot more on those things.
Yeah,
so,
3D objects versus objective.
3D, a non-reflective flat piece that doesn't have any neons or anything else.
Right.
Okay, no problem. You start adding neons, start spectral. So it's what of those problems do we want to solve next? Where do we want to focus our energy? Because it's more now the exceptions to the rules that we're trying to find. And then third point, somebody kind of was implying the ease of use. You know, we all know we should be using DICE or our other tools to validate and confirm, but a lot of people in this room rely on Delt.AE, and we can know the math and the numbers are not what they should be or the ideal, but it is ease of use, that I can have a photographer just double check something on Delt.AE, and if it doesn't look squirrely, they at least like, I can run the numbers and I can know how to do it, but they're not going to do that like 3 times a day, but they can run Delt.AE or something where they can just drag and drop a file. It checks, it gives them, okay, I've got to go ahead. And so making some of these tools that we rely on so that we can get them in the hands of the people so that the photographers can get back to photographing and just kind of know where they're at are critical.
I agree. We have to wrap it up. Cecile, one more? One more.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, the question is also for you, Scott. I'm not an expert, but I'm Egyptologist, and I'm very happy to be reusing the data and the images of the Metropolitan Collection. About 30,000 objects you have on ancient Egypt, and half of it is with images and half of it not. Is there also in this whole discussion a trade-off about, for me as an Egyptologist, I of course would love to have also this other half with photos. Is there a trade-off in how strictly you apply the standards and also the volume of quickly adding for 15,000 objects for Egypt alone, the images?
Well, two things. The standards would not impede digitizing faster or focusing on a campaign like the Rijksmuseum had done when they were closed. It was a campaign of clear purpose. At the Met, we're photographing for all purpose all the time. So I don't know from a programmatic point of view. Mm-hmm.
What is that? There was no letting go of the standards, and we moved very quickly through all kinds of objects. And that's more of an institutional priority issue
But
than
we'll bring
it is
it
a
home.
standards issue. And we've gone through larger campaigns to do collections like that, and we keep the standards in place.
Yeah.
And we look at those all as being master images. But it's really, again, talking to the director
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah,
making
prioritization.
sure everyone's on the same page.
Thank you, everyone.